Hi all, great to have you here, and thank you for joining our session, Reframing Data for Developing Community Custodianship for Social Change. So this session is going to be kind of an open discussion. So we're going to, I'll introduce myself, Eve will introduce herself, and then we'll start with a couple of provocations. And really we want to kind of try to understand what's going on with regards how we enable communities to take control of the data that's about them for positive change. So without further ado, I'm Julian Tate. I'm one of the co-founders of Open Data Manchester, which is based obviously in Manchester. And so we've been around since about 2010. And I suppose one of our missions is to help people understand and use the data that is about them and their communities. And many of the things that we find is that there's a number of barriers that we feel that needs to be addressed as far as people engaging with data, because it's obviously quite an abstract concept. So that's our interest with regards to this subject. So to you, Eve.
Thanks, Julian. It's great. I'm enjoying reading what people are popping in the chat. So I've got multiple hats, as we all do. So I'm a elected councillor, Manchester City Council, sat here in Whalley Range in South Manchester. So I'm interested from a political perspective about the role of data in politics, both with a big P and a little p. I'm also an activist on a number of issues, particularly around kind of climate change and around equality. So I'm particularly interested in the use of data in social change. And I'm a strategic leader in Greater Manchester. So I lead what's called Geo-Moving, which is our Greater Manchester ambition to design moving more back into everyday lives. And that really is about creating the conditions for culture change, system change, behaviour change to enable everyone to live active lives. And data is absolutely key to that. Who holds it, who owns it, how it's used, who has access to it. So I'm really hopeful that I come away with a whole load of learning to apply in all those contexts within Manchester and Greater Manchester. So yeah, great to be here and to be part of the conversation. Thanks, Julian.
Okay, so I'm just going to quickly share two slides. Well, that's the session that we're going to be talking about, and the other is just some questions we want people to think about and perhaps kind of mull over when we give the provocation. So I'll give one and then Eve will give another. And really this is about us trying to find what is good that's happening and who's doing stuff and how can we make connections, etc., and what are the challenges around that. So please do think of these questions. I'm going to have to end the sharing now, so you're going to have to look at me. But anyway, yeah, so well, what's this about? We all know that data can benefit individuals and organizations, and because it helps us to identify need, enable more efficient allocation of resources, and create more effective service delivery. But data is often a weapon that is wielded on many communities from the outside, and I think that's where we're coming from. This is why we're trying to provoke the conversation. So 2017, there's a post-book band called Sleaford Mods, based in Nottingham, exclaimed that in their song BHS, that we're going down like BHS while the able-bodied vultures monitor and pick at us. And in a way, lyrically, this represents a view that data and its use is not done with, but to people as a means of management and control. And I think this is one of the difficulties we have with data practice, and a difficulty that we have when trying to engage people when using data. And also this domain, traditionally the domain of data, has been one of the few of kind of shamans who speak the language of qual and quant, of people who read patterns in the numbers, and whose counsel is made to decisions that affect the many. Yet we believe, and I'm sure you do as well, that data shouldn't be just the preserve of the numerous and the analytical. Data describes a version of reality, of real world experience, yet often this reality is created through the lens of a distant observer without the context of lived and embodied experience. So data offers much, but sometimes misses a lot. So By reframing the relationship between communities in the process of data collection, design and analysis and custodianship, we think data can be more empowering than it is at present. So it can enable communities to better represent themselves through data, be it through challenging preconceived notions of who they are or challenging the decisions that are made about them. So decisions that could be formed from some kind of decision from a local authority, etc., or some kind of preconceived notion of an assumption of who these communities are about. And we're starting to see kind of new forms of data custodianship, so which can enable communities to start to have more control over the data that's about them. Some of you might have heard of data trusts or data cooperatives, and this is something which we think is quite may offer a few opportunities for developing that ownership of community data. So there's a few examples that I just want to briefly talk about that we've been involved in. One of those most recent, and it's a project, and Eve is also involved with this, so she may talk to this slightly, which is based in Chorlton, which is a climate action project. And it's working with the community to help them understand the impact of car use. And through this, we are working with cohorts of people to not only understand the data that's about their area, but also have some part in the process of the collection of that data, of defining what is important to them. How do they best want to represent themselves through data? So we're doing this through various means. So my colleague Sam, who's also on the call, has been developing and designing workshops to enable people to go out and count cars. I mean, it sounds quite prosaic, but getting people to do this, to have that kind of part in the process of collection, actually we find is not only an enjoyable experience. It's what we found, although this was done as we were coming out of lockdown, so any kind of social contact may be skewing that, but people really engage with the process of going out and counting cars in a way that we could then use to kind of challenge the data that was being collected through, say, the DFT, etc., using similar methods. Also around ways of getting people to host kind of traffic counters so that they were able to collect data that was relevant to their street, so they could understand the patterns and changes of traffic, transport, cars, bicycles, pedestrians, etc. And so this becomes a community asset, and you can see that this could then be used for bringing around some kind of meaningful change, because the evidence is there for them to best represent themselves. Another project that we've been involved with might be more seen to be more prosaic, and it kind of borrows from this kind of the whole idea of psychogeography, this idea that we map the places where we live through experience. The Joy Diversion program that we've been running, well, not so much over the last year and a half, because we haven't been able to really go out, tries to get people to reframe how they view the places they live from a purely transactional approach, because people, when they go to work or go shopping, they see that it tends to be much more of a transactional experience to more of an experiential. So there's this idea that this is your experience, this is personal to you, you have ownership of space. And the Joy Diversion program tries to encourage people to go out, experience the places where they live, and map, photograph, collect, draw, write poems. And this is their kind of way of collecting data. We don't actually say it's data collection at all, but it's a way of getting people to experience through fresh eyes the places that they probably know fairly well. And lastly, there's some work that we're doing around developing models for data cooperatives. We're doing this with a small energy cooperative. And through working with members of this cooperative, we're trying to understand how can we bring around these mechanisms so the members themselves are in control of the data that's about them, so that they can then use that data to further the causes of that cooperative, which is around climate mitigation, reduction of greenhouse gases, decarbonisation, etc. And the use of data, we're starting to see the potential that data held within communities and looked after by communities can probably have great benefit. So I will, that's my dog, so I've got a delivery, which is great timing. So I'm now going to hand over to Eve for a sec to go take it from there.
Excellent, thank you, Julian. I was warned via Twitter that there'd be a possible delivery happening just at this moment. For people that have just joined us, so yeah, I kind of come with three hats. One as an elected politician, so as a councillor in Manchester Council, one student leader in Greater Manchester, one as an activist, really. So just to give an example from each of those, first of all, really, as a councillor, it goes back to what Julian was saying around, I guess, sort of transactional relationships or far more relational ways of working with data. And certainly when I became a councillor, it was very much of a belief that we need to look at how we work alongside people in communities, how we empower and we grow power. Power isn't pie, it's not something to be carved up that we have to hold on. It's creating the conditions that it can rise like dough, and that we enable everybody to have that greater agency to shape their place, to shape their own lives, to support others around them, just as we've seen really in kind of like the COVID response in lots of communities. And the key part of that then is that knowledge and that information that equips you and enables you to understand, you know, what's going on around you, the system around you, and to be able to impact that. So data is absolutely key. And I think, I don't know how many of you, I can't see many faces, so I won't be able to get a reaction, but you can always use the reactions button. But how often is our experience in our interaction with politicians or with councils one of what feels like data extraction, where you are possibly consulted at the end of a process where somebody will attempt to extract some information from you for what can feel like their agenda. And often you don't come away feeling that you necessarily have more information that you want. In fact, often, even the information that you've given, you often don't even get to hear back. Or if you do, it's often so filtered or processed or selected that you don't hear your own voice or your own experience or your own feedback in what comes back to you. So I think that's often been our experiences within the political setting, within kind of relationship between people and state, is that data often is something where it's used for some people's purposes to have power over you, possibly with a very with the intentions of helping create a better life and a better place for you, but they're a very paternalistic view that it's for some people to have, some people to own, some people to use, because they're in a position of power to make your life better. And I think that whole way of working, that whole old kind of form of power, it is outdated. I don't think it works. I think that's partly why we're in the mess that we are. And I certainly don't think that's going to enable us to address our crisis in the environment, our crisis in health, our crisis in housing. And we've already seen over this year that, you know, if it was just left to a few small individuals, be they elected officials or others, to respond to COVID, we would have been in even more of a mess than we are now, because it was actually people being able to respond with community groups, with businesses, alongside others, you know, in council and the NHS, who were able to provide that care and response to people as neighbours, as people, as friends, as family, who care for each other. And having that information was key to that, knowing who needs something, knowing who is able to respond to that, simple forms of data that equip us to have that agency. So that's why I'm here and care about it. In terms of what we're doing, so I won't repeat kind of what Julian said about the Our Streets Chorlton project, but I initially put forward this proposal to the lottery about 18 months ago, because it's really looking at how we can take action in Chorlton, which is the ward that I represent, on climate action. And part of that, I thought it was absolutely key that we find ways to work with people to actually gather data together. And what data do they want? How's it accessible? How's it engaging? Not used as a stick, so not another kind of thou shalt get on your bike, thou shalt stop doing this or stop doing that, because we know that does not enable behaviour change. All that does is often shame us, it gives us guilt, it often creates frustration, because often it isn't the full picture and the full realities of our lives, it doesn't feel empathetic, it isn't relational, and it doesn't inspire us. So, you know, went to Open Data Manchester, knowing the great work that they do, that really is about working with people alongside them to think about what kind of information would you find useful? How can we set a process that is in itself building relationships? It is in itself building connections, it's building common purpose, it's building common insight, and to enable collective action to take place. And it, that takes time, but it builds trust and it builds all those things, that empathy that we know is so key to making change happen. And there's lots of great ways that we're seeing that take place. Then in my role as strategic leader in Greater Manchester, so in leading GM Moving, the same kind of population level scale challenges that I talked about in the environment and in our health are absolutely reflected when it comes to whether people can live active lives or not. So we know that whether you can get about in an active way day to day is absolutely impacted by all those systemic and structural and cultural barriers that exist. So again, those messages that people had of you should be more active, it's up to you as an individual, completely false, because that doesn't reflect at all the realities of people's lives. So again, what we've done is take a movement approach in which we're saying it's about the whole system working together to think across all those layers, whether it's policy, whether it's the physical environment, whether it's your social networks, it's the community groups, it's the places that you interact with. How do we all work together and help to create those conditions that enable people to be active in a way that works for them? And that means helping equip people with the data around their environment, about understanding what will help them, about them being able to pick and choose and have much greater control over the things that will work for them. And being able to think about what do we measure, because if you just measure, for example, just literally who's active, you're not collecting data on what are the key things that motivate people, for example, to maybe cycle or walk to school or to work. And we know that often the data that has been collected has been, for example, it's about how long it takes you to get to work, as opposed to going the joy of the journey, which actually lots of people talk about. They choose to travel in different ways because it gives them pleasure or not, and often that's because the people that have made those decisions about what we measure, how we collect that data, who we're collecting that data from, have come with their own bias about what is important and what's valued and what isn't. So all of this needs to be unpicked. So what we're doing is very much working with our academics and evaluation partner to think about a far more kind of open, engaging process for collecting information about what matters, questioning constantly what we're measuring, and doing that way it's far more iterative. It's not having an evaluation partner that says, okay, we're going to watch for 2 years, we're going to see whether you have increased number of active lives or not, then we're going to produce a report, and here's your report 2 years later that tells you've done all these things wrong, and now you could do this differently, and it gathers dust because, to be honest, it's already out of date and a whole load of people's lives and health have deteriorated over that period. But it takes a lot of time. It's that constant having to draw it out, translate, encourage people who are used to working within academic circles or political circles, who can be quite fearful of releasing any information, of sharing their thinking, unless they're confident that it's robust. And you have to say, do you know what? Just share what you know, share what you've heard, and let's explore it together, and not think that you have to have something that's all beautifully wrapped up already in a kind of beautifully polished report. So I'm keen to hear, what other people's experiences are of what's bad, that extraction or done to, or used against you, and the bias in that, and then let's and to hear what works well, what does good look like when it's engaging and empowering, would be fab. Is that enough, Julian?
That's great, Lee. Thank you very much. I think to start off, I would be so Eve, where do you think the potential benefits of this process lie? What would it give? Do you think it would give better engagement? It will get people to buy into what you're trying to achieve more?
Yeah, I mean, what we've seen already, I think, is when you're doing that with people is, as I said, you both will have, I think you'll be better in terms of what data you collect. And you're not just taking a very biased view of, for me, what's important, for example, is how quickly I can get to work on a linear journey, which we know is, gendered. There's a whole of bias. So what data you're collecting. Also the process in itself of how you're doing that, and doing that in the way that, you know, for example, the work we're doing with our streets, Julian, where, you know, people are out on a street together. So they have conversations with each other. They talk about why they're there, why it matters to them, why they care about, you know, people getting about by car or by some other means, and they form relationships. And then possibly magic happens and other action follows on from that. So that process of doing it collectively, not just somebody coming in and extracting that data. And then they walk away with greater knowledge and insight around their, you know, their lived environment. And that helps inspire them to go, well, what can I do? Actually, I care about this, you know, that level of toxicity in the air that I now am aware of. What can I do about that? Who else can I influence? And they will play an active role then in making that change happen. And I've seen this, yeah, across all those walks of life, and in the same time building, you know, that key trust that I think we talked about, that people don't feel they're being used as a unit of need or a unit to sell to. They're there as an active participant who has a role to play in all of this.
I think we've got a question from Bethan with regards to examples of analysis, the analysis part of the process being co-produced. And I think one of the things that we've done with the Our Streets Chorlton project, and we came from the point of view of when the original workshops were done, we were kind of asking what people were interested, what interested them, but also we kind of developed this understanding that if you are going to challenge something that is used generally as the evidence base when traffic planning is being done, then you have to collect data with that a similar sort of rigor, so that then you can kind of say, so Sam, who's also on the call, so you set down as kind of, this is the methods that they use. We're going to develop how we're going to do this, but the output of that process will be a standardized set of data that we can then use to represent to the transit agency or enable us to create a better picture. So I think at times there is a need to have that rigor, but that's not necessarily the full picture. It's the process of, these are the tools, and if you collect it this way, then you can then represent this directly. Is quite a strong. It's quite a strong tool to have in your toolbox, really, as far as communities are concerned. And I think so. It can be done. I think there's certain things that may be more specialist, but we haven't come across them yet, because perhaps within the conversations we're having with the communities at the present, the need for that complexity isn't quite existing at present.
I can see there's a couple of comments about co-production and co-design in the chat, which I think is absolutely key, in that, you know, how often are they used as buzzwords now of, we'll sit down and co-produce this, and there's a whole load of, there's really good examples and there's really bad examples where that's just watered down. But I think that's really key, that if you have parties coming together and they aren't all able to access and be equipped with the information, then are they in a position to be an active equal partner in that co-productive process? And I think still what we end up often happening is people come, and particularly now people are invited in, often unpaid, to bring their lived experience, data and insight. So they're already in an unequal position, and they still often feel that they're used in that process to share that information with others who take it away and filter it. So to give examples of where I've seen that work really well, so I'm part of what's called GM for Women, which is a coalition across Greater Manchester to make progress for equality for women and girls in Greater Manchester. Our tagline has been data, deeds and determination. So we've really started off with what is a data scorecard, where we pulled a number of indices to look at where the gender gaps are across Greater Manchester, and formed working groups around specific areas. So for example, I'm on one called participation, which is looking at representation and participation of women and girls in Greater Manchester. And I think the question around, there was it Bethan, you know, examples of where maybe that that process has been positive. What I've seen work there is in that working group, we've got a mix of people who are academics, who are politicians, who are activists, who are citizens, people who actually don't have citizen status within Greater Manchester, who are all coming together. And it's being able to take time, I think, to be able to go, let's really, yeah, it's creating a safe space, isn't it, where you can ask those questions about, I don't understand what this means. You can challenge each other to, you know, academics who sometimes present data in a way that isn't translatable, accessible, to actually draw that out and try and find ways that we can all make sense of it. And you honestly, what you know is that when you have those multiple different perspectives, it is so enriching in that process and everybody learns from it. But it takes time and it takes space, and it takes a belief that what you're going to come away from is something much greater than if that person who has that data and, you know, is seen to be bestowed, I guess, with a certain level of analysis and rigor in their collection is the only person to analyse it and evaluate it. And ways that we've done that are just then presenting it. I did a poem. We used the data and put it on the Emmeline Pankhurst statue. We've got this scorecard that we published. So trying to find ways, again, that are quite fun and engaging with it, that make it a bit more meaningful. But yeah, it'd be good to hear any other examples.
There's a great question from Stacey, Eve, which I think you might be able to answer with regards to, talks about the engaging people in their place, really, and I think it speaks to this a lot about the kind of power asymmetries that we have in consultation spaces. We recently we were talking to a local health trust about when they were consulting and they were trying to get people into doctor's surgeries to do the consultation, but as soon as you do that, you're creating a power asymmetry. So do you know any kind of examples of how you create an environment where everybody that nurtures trust?
Yeah, I think I can think of a number. I guess thinking about, if we think about the Our Streets project, in fact, Julian, again in Chorlton, where as a project group we were talking about trying to gather more information to understand people's travel habits. And of course, you know, some instinct was for some people, or, you know, you do a survey asking them how they get about. And actually, how do you know, that's one part of it, but you're asking a specific question, the information that we want, as opposed to going to people and asking them a more open question about what's important to them in their life, what matters to them, what's important to them about the local place, what do they like, and more appreciative questions from which you may be able to gather some information that helps inform what you need to know. But you're not just going in with your own direct question about what matters to you and your agenda. So it goes back to that formal person-centered approach of kind of asking people what matters to them, and making sure that you're constantly thinking all the time, what do they gain from that conversation? Do they gain anything? Is there anything in it for them? Or are they again just being, you know, even with the best intentions, used for some other purposes? So I think the conversations we've had there, Julian, around, you know, what conversations are we having and what's the purpose of that process, and how does it constantly equip people within a local place, within Chorlton in that instance, to feel that they've had, they've reflected on their own day, that they've come away feeling inspired and empowered to think about what changes they might want to make for themselves or help others make, not just handed it over to somebody else and waiting for somebody else to then make changes for them or to them. I don't know if that's, I'm interested, Stacey, you're a parish councillor, aren't you? Is there anything particular who's going to be brave and talk? Want to speak up?
Yeah.
Anything you've learned?
A cold, which is why I'm also hiding, so you don't have to look at my cold-ridden face. Well, I'm young people's working groups. I'm particularly in we're a really small percentage of young people, but they tend to be in the area of housing. Over COVID, they have particularly any negative that happened in the village, that is around social, always
Your sound's dipping in and out, I'm afraid, Stacey. Sorry, we keep losing you a
Oh,
bit.
sorry.
It seems like your cold's affecting your technology as well.
Yeah,
it's a virus in more than one. It's basically around engaging people in the social, to talk to them about their views of what goes, with a particular slant towards youth services.
Great, thank you. Yeah, so and that's a good example, isn't it, in terms of we've been thinking about young people and how we ensure that, again, we involve them, but in a way that they can lead on this agenda. And in shaping place, you know, there's a lot around what kind of places and spaces we've been thinking about are, you know, young people feel okay to be in, and how do you shape that? And often their voices are completely excluded in those conversations, and doing that in a way that's on their terms, not being used again. Who else has got a particular, anyone got any experiences, good or bad, to share?
What I want to ask Sam actually, who's got an example of the from the Mapping Mobility project of a when data is created by others and how that can lead to I suppose bad decisions being made. I don't know whether that's relevant, Sam.
Might reframe that into good decisions being, how do we use it? No, yeah, sure. So I think it was back in 2018. We did a project in Stockport, in a borough in Greater Manchester. They were redeveloping, doing a lot of the town centres, undergoing a lot of redevelopment, particularly around the bus stop. And we did a project with an organisation called Disability Stockport and also Age UK Stockport to work with the council to look at the routes that people took to travel into and out of the town centre, for example. Because for those of you who don't know Stockport, the town centre is actually, it's really lovely. It's very beautiful, lots of cobbled stones and steep steps, but it's very, very inaccessible. So we worked to sort of map how were people traveling when they came into the town centre, how were they moving around? And, you know, so we did a project where we got people from the organisation to map how they did that. So part of that was using big maps and getting them to draw on them. And part of it was going out and doing journeys with people and recording their experiences. So it was, two gentlemen who visually impaired, people in sort of mobility, people in wheelchairs, and sort of literally mapping the routes that they take and feeding that back to the council and looking about how we describe, because you know the urban environment kind of starts to fall apart and so on, but often the maps and the way that we use to plan these things come from a very specific perspective, usually a kind of able-bodied experience, or they're using digital maps and not really actually going out and looking at what is going on that place. You know, things like dropped curbs, or maybe there's areas where there's loads of puddles and they freeze really easily. That kind of stuff isn't mapped. So how do you plan for that? So it was really, really fascinating. So we actually got to go out and mapped a lot of these routes. And I mean, it fed directly into the redevelopment of the bus stations. So they've got like the bus stations sort of making sure it's, you know, accessible for everyone. So that was a really, really good example, I think, of a city council understanding that the knowledge that is contained in the communities, it's quite, you know, looking at different ways to get that knowledge really and map those experiences, I suppose.
Yeah, and that's been a common theme. So a lot of my work has been with Transport for Greater Manchester, and then with lots of the equalities networks across Greater Manchester, and very similarly, sense of people going, don't, you know, come out with us, come out onto the streets, try and cycle this trike, you know, try and navigate these routes, try and, you know, we've seen, so we might have seen, you know, Andy Byrne in the last couple of days doing these videos of travelling across Greater Manchester. Again, it's that experiential insight, isn't it, that Julian talked about, as opposed to maybe just having figures. So there's a question there again in that reframing data, is what do we perceive and what have we been told is data, and what have we been told has value or rigor and what doesn't. And I think we've been told for a long time that it has to look in a certain form, it has to arrive in a certain way from a certain person, and shaped for it to have value or insight or rigor. And we're really questioning that across Greater Manchester. So I think that mapping mobility example is a great one, and what, you know, to give people hope. I'm seeing this in all places now, not whole system yet, but lots of great examples of where we're really challenging the way that kind of insight is gathered and who with, so that it's making change happen. So an example of that in GM Moving is we've been doing a lot around, you know, obviously our kind of monitoring and evaluation. We're funded by Sport England, by the Greater Manchester Combined Authority, by the Health and Social Care Partnership, all of whom of course need to show that their funding is, you know, it's adding value, and all the normal processes that they need of reporting. But we're really challenging to say, well, if you just look for the typical KPIs, you're absolutely missing the point. We're not actually going to be able to make a difference in supporting the 25% of the population, the most inactive. You're not going to see your usual data outputs aren't going to measure whether or not we're having an impact or not. If we're growing the network of advocacy across the whole system and enabling more strategic leaders and more people at the grassroots level to make a difference on this agenda, you're not going to see that in your usual methods of measuring progress. So we have to find other ways, and we have to recognise the value of far more relational forms of influencing and progress and the changes, and things where sometimes you can't map the direct causation between what you did here and convening people in a conversation and change happening there. Sometimes there's a leap of faith, and no organisation or individual can claim credit for it. But does that matter if the outcome is a whole system is in that case getting more active? We know there's a whole load of ingredients that are helping create those conditions, but we can't pin down in your typical way of normal KPIs. But that challenges, doesn't it, funders, and it challenges institutions that have been, you know, pushed to be very risk averse and have to hold, you know, such high level of accountability for every penny they spend. So there's a real need, I think, collectively to go, how do we encourage others to be brave and to say, actually, we have to shift our frame of what is data, what is insight, and what purpose it's used by, and who with and how. And those stories, I think, are really powerful in doing that.
Right, we're nearly coming to the end, and there's a couple of great questions that would be great to to answer, but I think we've run out of time with regards about tools, and also about how we enable people to get how people are using the data themselves. We're training people to help them to use the data and understand the data that's about them and their communities, and also constantly looking for tools. So if anybody has got any great things to share, please do. We know a lot of people are doing lots of great stuff, and hopefully we can learn and also share. So thank you, everybody.